The train made a rattling noise as it traveled across the vast plains of the American Midwest, transporting numerous Japanese war prisoners who, only a few months prior, had engaged in intense combat in the Pacific region. With their faces pressed against the diminutive windows fitted with bars, they were mesmerized by the scenery of cornfields extending limitlessly, meticulously arranged red barns reaching high against the horizon, and expansive skies unlike any they had encountered on the Japanese islands. Just a few weeks before, they had anticipated death on the battlefield, having been taught that giving up was dishonorable. Now they were alive, unarmed, and perplexed, moving deeper into a territory they were informed was populated by vengeful adversaries. Initially, the men quietly speculated among themselves that these verdant expanses harbored hidden acts of brutality. They had previously heard rumors before being captured, stories shared in hushed tones indicating that the Americans would subject prisoners to starvation, humiliate them, or inflict even worse treatment. After all, the attack on Pearl Harbor remained a painful memory in the American consciousness. They were certain that no kindness could be expected from individuals who had witnessed their sailors perishing in the destruction of December 1941. The prisoners envisioned angry mobs awaiting them at the train stations, eager to exact retribution. However, as the train decelerated and they caught sight of the small towns along the route, they observed only inquisitive faces. American citizens congregated at intersections, some accompanied by children waving, not spitting or yelling, but observing with a combination of amazement and wariness. This disturbed the Japanese men because it differed from the animosity they had anticipated. As the train eventually came to a stop within a guarded facility encircled by barbed wire, the men prepared themselves for physical attacks or mocking insults. Instead, the American guards issued commands firmly, but without harshness. They were provided with rations, including simple bread, potatoes, and even meat, and directed to their living quarters. The provision of food surprised them. Many had anticipated meager rations, yet what was offered was abundant compared to the scarcity they had experienced back in Japan. The barracks were basic, but the beds were clean, and the men received blankets. The feeling of unease intensified. Why would the opposing side concern themselves with their comfort? Throughout the initial nights, the prisoners remained awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of cicadas buzzing in the surrounding fields, and the faint noise of tractors in the early hours of the morning. They speculated about what awaited them. Some believed that this was merely a temporary deception, and that mistreatment would commence once they were assigned work. Others took note of the guards' discipline and proposed that perhaps the Americans simply intended to exploit them for labor before disposing of them. A minority, recalling the intense propaganda disseminated by the Japanese army, insisted that Americans were too gentle, too indulgent, and that this unusual comfort might signify a weakness. Nevertheless, none could disregard the growing disquiet within them. The reality differed from what they had been led to believe. The initial days were marked by regular morning attendance checks, controlled walks around the grounds, and directions delivered in awkward English, barely grasped by most. Yet, amidst the order, there were subtle, unexpected occurrences. The guards refrained from hitting them when they stumbled in line. They permitted the prisoners to correspond with their families through the International Red Cross. One guard even provided a cigarette to a prisoner who was without one, a kind act that would have been unimaginable if their roles were reversed. These instances of humanity sharply contrasted with the image of the ruthless adversary they had been instructed to fight until death. The pivotal moment arrived when they learned they would soon be assigned to work, not in manufacturing plants or mines, but on farms located nearby. The news caused hushed whispers throughout the barracks. Farmers? The very farmers who surely had lost sons or brothers at Pearl Harbor and in other battles. The men exchanged worried looks filled with apprehension. In their minds, this was where the cruelty would finally be revealed. Surely these civilians would spit on them, curse them, or exploit them like animals. No soldier in the Imperial Army had ever been prepared for the possibility of kindness from an enemy's common people. That night, as the cicadas buzzed outside the fence, many of the prisoners struggled to fall asleep. They contemplated the fields they had observed from the train, The barns painted a vibrant red set against the American sky. The next day they would leave confinement and enter that unfamiliar world, encountering face to face those who had every justification to despise them. And none could have predicted that instead of retribution, they would soon experience words delivered with a kindness they deemed impossible after Pearl Harbor. As the first light of dawn broke over the camp, the prisoners were gathered into formation. The air was fresh, carrying the scents of cultivated earth and freshly cut vegetation. And for the Japanese soldiers, it felt both unfamiliar and strangely peaceful. The guards announced names, their voices stern but not unkind, and then escorted small groups out through the gates. Beyond the fence, vehicles were waiting to transport them further into the countryside. The men boarded cautiously, each step heavy with anxiety, certain that humiliation and animosity awaited them. Yet, even before the vehicles departed, they observed something unusual. Farmers had arrived with their carts, standing at a distance, not to mock, but to gaze curiously at the men who had once been their foes. Inside the vehicles, the prisoners sat in silence, their thoughts filled with conflicting emotions. They imagined the faces of Americans who had lost loved ones at Pearl Harbor, men who must have been filled with rage at the sight of Japanese uniforms. They envisioned rough hands poised to strike them the moment they stepped onto the ground. Some quietly murmured that perhaps the guards would ignore any violence and allow revenge to occur unchecked. However, when the vehicles screeched to a halt near a farmland, they were surprised by a welcoming scene, not aggression or verbal abuse. Women were hanging clothes to dry, kids were playing tag near a barrier, and a man farming was wiping his forehead before exiting his vehicle. The normalcy of it all felt strange, almost as if they had entered an untouched world unaffected by conflict. The initial hours served as a trial period. The captives were guided through rows of maize and stretches of grain, provided instruments, and educated on their use primarily through physical communication. The armed personnel stayed close by with their firearms casually positioned, refraining from raising their voices unless the individuals made critical blunders. Although strenuous, the job held familiarity. A large number of the detained individuals hailed from agricultural communities in their homeland, and despite differences in the types of crops, they easily recognized the natural beat of cultivating soil. As they worked diligently in the fields, they were startled to discover they were not in mortal peril. Instead, they were getting treatment as valuable members of the workforce whose input was needed, rather than foes deserving mistreatment. At noon, when the heat from above became intense and oppressive, the overseers ordered the men to take a break. A recess period was declared, and a farmer came forward holding a container of liquid. The captured individuals grew still, positive that they were about to fall victim to a trap. But the farmer merely positioned the vessel on the ground, plunged in a utensil, and motioned for them to have a drink. The water was refreshingly cool, without contamination, and carried a flavor reminiscent of metal and minerals. To individuals anticipating insults or contamination, the gesture was truly unexpected. The farmer offered little conversation, just a single head movement before taking a step back. But the quiet on its own was without animosity. It was a quiet endorsement of regarding them not as monsters, but as people. When they made their way back to their lodging that night, the atmosphere was thick with hushed murmurs. Each detained person recounted what they had witnessed. Children's gazes devoid of spitting, women going about their work without any fear, a farmer providing hydration, free of any offense. Some let out strained laughter, while others conveyed their bewilderment by frowning. How was this remotely plausible? The information they received was that the population of the U.S. was unfeeling. However, the proof that their eyes recorded said something else. It was just getting started, but their thought processes were already experiencing a transformation. Be that as it may, uncertainty remained. Plenty were firm in the belief that this was a momentary situation, and once the thrill diminished, resentment would emerge. They brought to mind the strike on Pearl Harbor and the deaths that occurred on that specific December morning. Surely no country could without difficulty pardon an injury as profound as that. However, as they rested on their assigned beds, hurting from genuine labor instead of abuse, a query silently agitated them. What if the U.S. Citizens were misrepresented by their commanding officers? What if these modest actions revealed something more profound, an element they were unprepared to deal with? The following day, the armed guards once more summoned the captured individuals to assemble, and prior to long they were directed to the trucks that were waiting. The men's pent-up emotions had now intertwined with a wary sense of wonder. They couldn't shake off the memory of the farmer's kind gesture of offering water. Was it purely a random act of goodwill, or was there a common thread in this unusual politeness? As the trucks rolled down the unpaved country roads, the prisoners gazed out at the fields passing by, observing farmers tending to their livestock and tractors inching across the land. In contrast to the war zones they had left, this area was more about planting and reaping than destruction and death. That day, their final destination was another farm, larger than the last one. The farmer who lived there was a towering man with wide shoulders and skin tanned by the sun. He didn't treat them with aggression, yet he didn't smile. He simply gestured toward the rows of sugar beets and beans, telling the guards what to do in an even tone. The prisoners were given shovels and sacks, and soon they fell into the routine of labor again. But what stood out to them the most was not the work itself, but the farmer's constant presence. He stayed nearby watching as the men hunched over and worked the soil, but his look wasn't mean. It seemed practical, as if he saw them as additional workers needed to keep his farm going instead of as enemies. The hours ticked by under the blazing sun. Sweat poured down their backs, and blisters popped up on their hands, but the farmer didn't become violent or stare at them with the hatred they had anticipated. Instead, when one of the younger prisoners stumbled due to exhaustion, the farmer signaled for him to rest by the fence. The guards let him do so without question. Soon after, the farmer's wife came out, carrying a container of milk and a loaf of bread. She went to the guards first, offering them food, and then, after a short pause, she turned to the prisoners. To their surprise, she put the jug and bread on the ground so they could reach it, nodding for them to help themselves. The men looked at each other in confusion before one carefully tore off a piece of bread. It was fresh, soft, and unlike anything they had tasted in months. The gesture felt almost too much to bear because it was so strange. Bread and milk, symbols of basic kindness, were being given to men who had fought for a country that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The prisoners ate in silence, each bite filled with bewilderment. Some were too ashamed to meet the woman's eyes, feeling bad about accepting kindness from people they had hurt. Others chewed slowly, wondering if this was a trick. But nothing else happened. There was no cruelty, no laughter, no insults, just the buzzing of bees in the fields and the sound of the farmer's boots as he went back to his work. As the day went on, the men began to notice small details they hadn't seen before. The farmer's kids were peeking from behind the house door, curious but not scared. A canine sauntered nearby, its nose twitching as it examined the unfamiliar individuals in worn-out attire, its tail swaying without discrimination. The woman of the house occasionally shifted her gaze toward them, her countenance serene, her hands occupied with household duties. It seemed as if the conflict hadn't eradicated the fundamental humanity of this family, even when confronting those formerly labeled as adversaries. That subsequent evening, upon the prisoners' return to the encampment, their burdens extended beyond aching muscles. They bore a perplexing query that now asserted itself more forcefully than before. What rationale would compel Americans, who had endured substantial losses at Pearl Harbor and in numerous Pacific battles, to opt for treating them with such respect? The solution eluded their grasp, yet the seeds of uncertainty concerning everything they had been indoctrinated about the opposition had already taken root profoundly. By the arrival of the third week dedicated to agricultural labor, the prisoners had acclimated to a consistent pattern. Each dawn, they were transported beyond the confines of the barbed wire, traversing past barns adorned with fading crimson paint and fields abundant with crops. They exerted themselves beneath the sun's rays, their postures hunched and their hands chafed. Nevertheless, the most unsettling aspect for them wasn't the rigorous labor itself, but rather the conduct exhibited by the agriculturalists. One might have anticipated disdain, biting remarks, or even overt animosity. Instead, they were greeted with unassuming politeness. A straightforward, "Good morning," expressed in a gentle, unwavering tone, impacted the men with considerable force. The initial instance occurred when an elderly farmer whose offspring had served in the Pacific acknowledged the contingent with a nod and a few English phrases comprehensible even to the prisoners. Labor diligently. Consume food subsequently. There was no hint of mockery or bitterness in his inflection, solely practicality infused with an element remarkably akin to benevolence. The Japanese individuals exchanged wary looks, uncertain about trusting their auditory perception. How could this individual, who undoubtedly had perused accounts of Pearl Harbor in his periodicals, and perhaps had interred a relative during the war, address them as if they were merely seasonal employees? As the days unfolded, these subtle gestures proliferated. Farmers imparted instructions without elevating their vocal volume. When errors materialized, rows planted unevenly, implements dropped, the rectifications were resolute but devoid of cruelty. One farmer even ventured a smile, a fleeting expression across his weather-beaten visage, when a prisoner grappled with lifting a weighty sack, prompting another to rush to his assistance. The Japanese individuals were profoundly bewildered. In their native land, prisoners, if apprehended at all, frequently endured brutal treatment, regarded as dishonored and unworthy of existence. Conversely, their captors here appeared constrained by an unspoken code that mandated restraint and, at times, empathy. For the prisoners, the bewilderment was compounded by the recollection of Pearl Harbor. That pivotal day had been ingrained within them even during their period of captivity. The audacious strike that propelled America into the war, the symbol of Japanese supremacy. And yet Pearl Harbor also represented the enduring wound borne by every American. The detainees struggled to understand how individuals living through the aftermath of that war could interact with them without expressing intense animosity. It appeared contrary to what they expected, as if the local agricultural workers were intentionally suppressing the negative emotions the prisoners anticipated encountering. One afternoon, while the men were working in a field of soybeans, the wife of a farmer walked up with a basket filled with apples. She gave some to the armed guards and then, shocking the prisoners, she extended the basket to them for their taking. The moment stood still. Japanese fighters, who were once sworn adversaries, were now partaking of the fruit offered to them by the very people whom they believed would hold the deepest resentment toward them. The delightful taste of the apples felt almost too much to bear. Some consumed them rapidly while others hesitated, but all were touched by the undeniable reality. It was an act of generosity that penetrated deeper than any weapon. These interactions caused unrest among the men as night fell. They murmured to each other in their living quarters, their voices low and filled with tension. "Why are they behaving in this way?" one would inquire. Another would respond, "Perhaps it is a carefully laid plan to deceive us." Yet no deception ever manifested. The acts of kindness were repeated consistently, seemingly unremarkable to the farmers themselves, yet profoundly significant to those held captive. Gradually, the intense feelings of dread lessened, being replaced by a developing respect for those individuals who treated them with consideration. Despite having substantial reasons to harbor bitterness, the understanding settled within them with considerable weight. The Americans were not only formidable in terms of their industry and weapons, they also demonstrated a strong moral character. And for the imprisoned Japanese soldiers, who had been nurtured on narratives of ruthless antagonists, this realization caused them more unease than any military defeat. As the summer progressed, the pattern of being held captive was no longer defined only by physical barriers and armed personnel, but also by the regular work performed in the agricultural fields. The Japanese detainees got up as the sun rose, traveled in vehicles past quiet towns, and found that they were working alongside American farmers whose demeanor remained surprisingly composed. The aspect that most astonished the men was not only the absence of hostility, but also the presence of typical human interactions. Each day brought forth small occurrences that gradually wore down the barrier between those who were holding them captive and those being held. It commenced with simple acknowledgments. Farmers, whose hands displayed the wear of many years of physical labor, would nod and say, "Morning," as the prisoners entered their working areas. Even though most of the Japanese individuals did not understand the specific word, they picked up on the tone. gentle, neutral, and entirely free of malice. The initial time it occurred, many of them turned away with feelings of shame, unsure of how they should respond. However, as the days went by, some took the risk of giving a slight bow in return, which was the only gesture they were familiar with that conveyed respect. Before long, these acknowledgments evolved into a normal event, discreet recognitions of a shared humanity even in the midst of a war. Shared meals introduced additional encounters. During the midday hours, when the sun was scorching intensely, the farmers would take a break for their midday meal. The prisoners received rations of bread, legumes, or potatoes from their overseeing guards. Yet sometimes a farmer would share a piece of fruit or pass around a container of drinking water. One day, a young boy hardly older than 10 came to the group of captives carrying a basket full of peaches, picked fresh from his family's trees. With nervous motions, he started giving them out, his big eyes quickly glancing at the tanned faces of the men. Even though the prisoners were unable to talk to him, they took the peaches with quiet respect. The pleasant sensation of sweetness outlasted the actual taste of the fruit. It served as a reminder that compassion still existed, even amidst the conflict of war. Cooperation was frequently a necessity when performing the work. While guards maintained a distant watch, the farmers took on the role of instructors, demonstrating how to use equipment or showing where to plant rows. Wanting to prove their usefulness, some prisoners quickly copied the actions. Some even attempted to communicate using their limited English. They would ask questions hesitatingly in this manner. Surprisingly, the farmers would nod in response, and occasionally chuckle quietly when they mispronounced words. These small interactions, though awkward, were significant. Hearing laughter that was devoid of mockery was a revelation for the Japanese, who had been conditioned to anticipate only brutality. Not every moment was straightforward. There were instances of flared tempers, dropped tools, misunderstood instructions, and repeated orders. Even during those times, the farmers rarely raised their voices in anger. One day, a prisoner accidentally broke the handle of a hoe. He braced himself for a physical strike, since he knew that such a mistake would have been severely punished in his own army. Instead, the farmer picked up the broken piece, shrugged, and went to get another tool. There was no insult, no physical attack, just a tired sigh. That evening, back in the barracks, the man admitted that the simple shrug made him feel more ashamed than any physical punishment could have. The prisoners gradually began to see that they were not simply invisible figures in the fields. They were being recognized, spoken to, and given a level of respect they had not anticipated. Every nod, every shared piece of fruit, and every shared laugh at imperfect English attempts became a piece of a bigger picture, contradicting all the harsh lessons they had learned during the war. And as each day went by, the kindness of the farmers had a greater impact than any weapon ever could. It led them to question not only their adversaries, but their own beliefs as well. As the weeks turned into months, the distance between prisoner and farmer started to diminish in ways that none of them had imagined. Initially, the interactions were silent, consisting of gestures, nods, and the exchange of tools, but gradually words started to enter into their conversations. A small number of the younger Japanese prisoners had received some English education in school. Learning small bits of vocabulary was more intended for understanding enemy propaganda than for actual communication. They used these words carefully, speaking with thick accents and broken grammar. But the farmers responded with patience. One farmer, seeing a prisoner struggling with carrying a heavy bag of grain, pointed to himself and said, "Heavy." The word resonated in the prisoner's thoughts, simple yet clear. He repeated it clumsily, which brought a smile to the farmer's face. Another detainee, wanting to know the names of the produce, gestured toward some orange roots and inquired, "What's this called?" The agriculturalist squatted, extricated one from the earth, and repeated the word, "Carrot, carrot." The group of incarcerated men quietly repeated the term amongst themselves, relishing it as if it were a clandestine phrase. For those from Japan, language was more than just a means of communication. It represented a delicate connection that bridged a seemingly impossible gap. They had anticipated only hostility from the locals. However, the agrarian people appeared enthusiastic to impart to them small elements of their existence. Some even expressed amusement whenever the prisoners mispronounced certain words. It wasn't mean-spirited laughter, rather an acknowledgement of their collaborative attempts. It had a softening effect. Curiosity was reciprocated. During calmer moments when the security personnel weren't paying close attention, the agriculturalists posed straightforward inquiries. "Japan," they would articulate, gesturing towards the captured soldiers, then mimicking a question using hand motions. A few of the men acknowledged, clumsily attempting to describe their hometowns, their relatives, their dwellings through physical gestures. They sketched shapes in the dirt, depicting mountains, habitations, even a rough depiction of the Japanese ensign. The farmers observed these depictions with intrigue, as if endeavoring to envision lives occurring far across the expanse of the Pacific. One particular day, during a midday respite, an aged agriculturalist attempted something quite bold. He took a seat on a section of the fence, ignited his smoking pipe, and directed a question towards a prisoner. "Family?" The man paused momentarily, uncertain if he should respond, but ultimately uttered in faltering English, "Wife, 2 children." He gestured in an eastwardly direction toward a land he was no longer able to access. The agriculturalist acknowledged slowly, tapping his own chest as if indicating that he too was part of a family unit. Further verbal communication was unnecessary. During that instant, the pair of men, previously adversaries and victims, were simply parents estranged by vast oceans and armed conflict. These interactions resonated profoundly with the imprisoned soldiers. Inside the Imperial Army's framework, exhibiting vulnerabilities or speaking candidly regarding kin was discouraged, even prohibited. Yet in this location on American territory, a basic inquiry initiated both emotional pain and solace concurrently. The affability demonstrated by the agricultural workers compelled the Japanese to grapple with realities they had been taught to disregard. That their foes weren't anonymous adversaries, but instead were human beings possessing existences, misfortunes, and affections quite akin to their own. During the evening hours, the living quarters were filled with whispered discussions concerning these encounters. Certain prisoners derided the agricultural workers as feeble, insisting that the Americans were bereft of martial fortitude. Conversely, others spoke in hushed tones about how these exchanges had an unsettling impact on them. They contrasted it with the austere control exhibited by their own commanding officers, who had never been kind in their speech, who would have penalized even minor errors in articulation or movement. The disparity irritated them, prompting inquiries that none dared to express loudly. Had they been given misinformation throughout regarding the genuine essence of their adversaries? By the time the foliage of autumn commenced its descent onto the terrain, the agriculturalists and prisoners had fostered a tenuous and unusual connection, one constructed through fragmented English, reluctant head nods, and nonverbal communication across the expanse of armed conflict. And for those from Japan, each term acquired held significance beyond its definition. It felt like a revelation. Kindness can show up in places where history says it shouldn't. In this unlikely corner of the world, amidst the scars of war and the weight of memory, compassion grew in the cracks. Winter crawled in, spreading frost over the barns and fields, turning the landscape brittle and silent. The air grew sharper, colder, carrying with it a sense of waiting, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The prisoners noticed themselves thinking more about all the contradictions in their lives, the way past certainties had begun to unravel since their arrival in this foreign place. Even as the chores changed, less planting, more fixing fences, feeding animals against the chill, the farmers kept treating them with the same quiet respect as they did in summer. There was no shift in tone, no hardening of hearts as the days grew shorter and the nights more unforgiving. For the Japanese men, this steady decency was unsettling, like stepping into a room and finding the floor had moved beneath them. Every week, the confusion pressed harder against the discipline they'd carried from home, the rigid codes drilled into them since boyhood. At night, after lights out, they whispered about it, their words hushed but urgent, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile new understanding taking root. They compared the way they were treated here with stories they'd heard about their own army's prisoners in China or the Philippines, stories filled with brutality, humiliation, and suffering. Some had even guarded captives themselves, had looked into the eyes of men who expected no mercy and offered none in return. The Japanese military code had no room for compassion. Prisoners got beaten, starved, left to die. Being captured was shameful, almost like you weren't even human. You were a ghost, a failure, someone to be forgotten. But here, thousands of miles from home, everything was inverted. They got food, blankets, even kind words from Americans whose brothers had died at Pearl Harbor, whose families bore the pain of the war's first violence. For some, the contradiction was crushing, a weight that made every meal taste like guilt. For others, a strange relief, a quiet loosening of the knots inside. One man, who used to be a petty officer, finally admitted he couldn't make sense of it. "We were told Americans had no honor," he whispered, the words thick with disbelief. "But these farmers, they bow their heads when they pass their own dead in the cemetery. They treat us like men, not animals." His voice shook. In Japan, saying something like this would have been dangerous, possibly even treacherous. But inside these barracks, his words landed. Others nodded. Maybe they couldn't say it out loud, but they felt it too. Each of them carried their own private reckoning, a slow chipping away at the walls built by propaganda and fear. The contrast hit even harder when letters from home arrived, sometimes through the Red Cross. The notes reminded them of shortages in Japan, of families scraping by, of winter about to get worse if the war kept going. A litany of hunger and cold, of mothers patching clothes, and children searching for firewood. They pictured their wives and kids hunting for scraps while they, the prisoners, ate bread and meat in a strange land, warmth in their bellies and boots on their feet, guilt tangled with disbelief. How could the enemy, who bombed Tokyo and sank their ships, show them more mercy than their own officers ever had? The war had taught them to expect only cruelty from the other side, and yet here they were, cared for by those they were supposed to hate. The farmers seemed to sense all this, even without anyone saying it. Their kindness was never a performance, never intended to shame or belittle. They didn't use their kindness to humiliate. They didn't make grand gestures of forgiveness or speeches about reconciliation. They just kept showing up, nodding good morning, offering a quiet, good work when chores were done, sharing a quick laugh when a cow nudged someone too close to the fence. Small things over and over, until the routine itself became a kind of gentle argument against hatred. Hard to ignore. Each gesture was a reminder that decency could survive, even thrive, in the unlikeliest soil. As the days passed, the Japanese prisoners found themselves changed in ways they could barely articulate. The routine itself forced the Japanese men to admit something they'd never expected. Their enemy refused to hate them. In the rhythm of work, in the exchange of glances, in the simple act of being seen and treated as human, an old certainty dissolved. They had been taught to believe in absolute lines between friend and foe, yet those lines blurred with every shared meal, with every moment of unspoken understanding. Beneath the weight of war and the cold of winter, something else took root, a fragile hope that even in the darkest of times, kindness could survive, and maybe even heal. By December, 3 years had passed since Pearl Harbor. American newspapers still ran somber reminders, but out in the fields where prisoners worked, nobody talked about revenge. Some farmers had lost sons in the Pacific War. Even so, they treated the prisoners, men from the very country that brought them that pain, with surprising calm. For the prisoners, that quiet hit harder than any insult. It showed a kind of strength they hadn't expected, the strength to choose dignity instead of anger. Many prisoners thought about this, and it stung. America's real power wasn't just in its factories, or its planes, or its weapons. It was in these ordinary people who, even with grief heavy on their hearts, offered kindness to strangers. That, more than any battle, left the prisoners wrestling with everything they'd been taught. When the war finally ended, the mood in the camps shifted. News trickled in. A word from a guard, a headline caught in a tossed-aside paper. The quiet announcement that Japan had surrendered. For the prisoners, it was a strange mix of heartbreak and relief. Their country had fallen. They were still alive, though, standing in the middle of the enemy's land, shown a decency they still couldn't quite wrap their heads around. With repatriation coming, they prepared to return to a home in ruins, carrying stories their families wouldn't easily believe. Those last weeks on American farms felt heavy. Prisoners walked the same rows they'd worked through the seasons, knowing their time there was almost up. The farmers seemed to sense it too. Some offered a few extra words, a simple good luck or safe home. Others pressed a small gift into a prisoner's hand. An apple, a pair of gloves, a neatly folded handkerchief. Not grand gestures, but they hit deep, deeper than any medal or speech ever could. On the day they left, the trucks waited just like before. The men climbed on, carrying barely more than what they'd arrived with, but now burdened with memories they couldn't leave behind. As the trucks rumbled away, many prisoners craned their necks for a last look at the fields. Here and there, a farmer stood by his gate, raising a hand in farewell. One old man took off his hat and held it to his chest until the convoy slipped out of sight. Overcome, the prisoners bowed their heads in return, a gesture that said what words couldn't. The journey back across the Pacific was thick with nerves. The men whispered about what waited for them back in Japan, bombed-out cities, hungry families, the shame of defeat. Still, their thoughts kept circling back to the farmers. They remembered the first cold water handed to them out in the fields, the boy who split his peaches with them, the women who passed them bread without a second thought. And they remembered the kind words, even though Pearl Harbor still left a raw wound in America. For a lot of them, these moments felt stranger than losing the war itself. Once they got back to Japan and shared what happened, people just stared. Some shook their heads, refusing to believe Americans, who had been villains in every story, could act with any sort of kindness. Others just fell silent, not sure what to make of it. But for the prisoners, those memories stuck. They cut deeper than any scar the war left behind. They weren't spared by orders from leaders, but by regular people, folks who should have hated them, but didn't. Years later, some of those men wrote about what happened. They wanted people to know they'd found real humanity in a place they never expected. What they brought home wasn't just survival. It was a lesson in humility, compassion, and the stubbornness of decency. Even Pearl Harbor, with all the anger and heartbreak it caused, hadn't turned every American cold. The war taught them to brace for hate. But out there in rural America, they found something else entirely. That truth stuck with them, shaped them, and haunted them long after the fighting ended. The kindness they found, quiet, simple, unexpected, did more to disarm them than any weapon ever could.